All right, let me copy this. No, that is if you keep going, I think, then you'll get to the meetup. Yep. All right. Well, we'll keep going. I'm gonna make a public call out to all you people attending remotely. Pretty sparse here. If you get the chance to show up in person, definitely. I think we all benefit from having a group of people to talk to and bounce ideas off of and stuff. So I would encourage that. A couple other small housekeeping things. I'm going to put a poll out on Slack. Probably is just figuring out when people wouldn't be available for class around the 4th, because I know a lot of people will be busy then. So we definitely canceling at least one of the classes. We'll see based off when people are available. What else? Yeah, I also plan on having the section up where you guys be able to start doing some hands-on with getting React practice through a little project, hopefully this weekend. And then what we'll probably do on Tuesday next week is just make sure everyone has that working on their system and start working through some of those here in class to help get sort of that hands-on practice. Because we're going to be covering the last major, there's other topics in React, of course, other ways to do things and a lot of conceptual concepts. But the last major piece of functionality that we haven't really discussed about how React works is the component lifecycle. So before we start with that, any questions on anything we've been going over? No? All right. So let's do a short quiz with this large group. You guys are under pressure now. You can't hide behind other people answering the questions for you. Got to answer them yourself. You say, what are the two different types of components in React that you can create? Think so? Yeah? Yeah? All right. Function components and class components. Great. Exactly. So now talking about components, what does React call the data that is passed into a component? So when you're creating or using a component, what is the data called that gets passed into it? Children is a special version of one of these. The props. All right. So then if props are what the data is called that gets passed into a component, and I'm going to apologize real fast. I'm so bad with names. Can I get both of your names so I can try and internalize them? Marcelino. Diana. Oh yeah, Wonder Woman. Warrior or Maverick. Maverick. All right. So if props are what the data is called that gets passed into a component, do you remember what is the data that is managed internally by a component called? This is what we learned about in the last class.
JSON?
It's not called JSON. That's a data format. Do you know, Diana? Not sure? It's called state. So the two different React things are props, get passed into a component, and then data that the component manages itself is called state. So maybe you won't remember this, but what component method is called to change a value in the component state? Set state. This dot set state. Yep. Exactly. All right. Are there any questions about this stuff on this quiz? Yeah?
So what do you mean by managed internally? I'm not really sure.
Yeah, what I mean is that like props get passed into a component. So, you know, when we're, let's just pull up, what's up? Welcome to the huge classroom we've got going. Oh, I'm going to be doing some more coding today. I wanted to ask a quick question because last time I did this, people said, which one of these is more visible? Is the light, oh, let me go back to it. Oh my God. Is a light theme more visible than the dark one?
Definitely.
Is it much better? All right, we're going to stick with that then. Yeah, well, that's not what matters when you're, all right, so, you know, when you're working with a prop or a component, so I don't know what, let's do a hello, right? Like this is a prop because it gets passed into it. So it's coming in from outside, something else is setting that value. But anything on your state, do you remember where we initialize the state on a component? You do it, yeah, this is how you refer to itself, but do you remember what method we tend to initialize state in?
Function.
What? It's a function. Do you know what it's called? The constructor. Right. But the gist of that is it's setting that state on itself, right? That's that component managing itself, just like any other object, as opposed to values coming into it from outside. So those are the differences between props and state. Props is internal to a component, or props is external, coming in from outside. State is internal, managed by the component.
So if you were to change what's going in, if you were like, if you were to change what is going in externally to the prop, would the state also change?
Not necessarily, no. No. What I'll say is no, not unless you change the state. We can look at that today because we're going to be working through just some hands-on stuff about React Lifecycle and components. Oh, and if you haven't already, recommend you try and log into your Cloud9 environment because instead of working in CodePen or something, we're going to be working off of a Create React app application. So either the one that we set up last time or we can get another one set up. Do you have that all set up and working or? Okay, great. So that's what we'll be working today. I'll be working locally on my system, but it'll be the same process. I just am a little more comfortable with the tools and can do a better job of zooming in and out to help out with the presentation on local. All right, so let's build on that. And then we're going to dive in and do a lot of just hands-on stuff today working through this. So for class components, which is different than functional components, React doesn't actually recreate the component whenever the state or props change. So if you remember, let me try and pull up an example here. If we hop on CodePen and let's look at like the, is it the simple clock example? Might not be what I'm looking for, but something like this. So if you remember here, we've got a clock and we're just re-rendering it using the set interval we're calling render, and it's re-rendering a clock every second, right? Now we're doing it, we're like fetching the date inside of the clock, but we don't have to do that. We could instead get those values, say, out here and pass them in. So we could say let time equals, well here, let's do this. Date equals new date. Let time equal date dot to locale time string, and let formatted date equal date dot to locale date string. Now, if we wanted to pass those into our components, our clock component here, instead of getting that data inside of it, does anybody remember how we're going to pass those in? Yeah, but even before that, we need to give some props, define some props for our clock, right? So we could say, we could call them just date. It doesn't matter what we call these. And that's going to be something. We want to pass some value in and like time, right? So let's call them that. And then inside these curly braces, we can reference our sort of the escape out of JSX back to JavaScript. So there we can reference our variable names. So now if we pass those in and we're passing this, those become part of this props object in our component, how can we reference them? How can we change these bits of code to reference the variables that we passed in or the props that we passed in instead of computing this internally? This dot formatted date is what you think? Yeah. Or this one is the time, so this dot time. Yeah. And this one is this dot formatted date. All right, let's see if that works. Something's not right. It's definitely rendering our component, but not these. Can anybody figure out what's wrong? There's a couple things wrong with this. One of the first is this is a functional component and not a class component. Yeah, so in that case, it's not this because we don't have an object to refer to. It's props. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. Cool, we're getting the time. That's looking good. We still don't have the date. Can anyone explain what's wrong with the date? No, we're referencing, what are we trying to reference? Formatted date? But what did we name the prop that we passed into the clock? Date, not formatted date. We got the value from the formatted date variable, but in our component, we named it date. So if we call that date, now we should be rendering just as we expected, right? So the interesting thing about this and what's going on here is we are actually re-rendering this component and recreating this whole function gets called again every time, right? So this function gets rerun from scratch, all of it gets rerun, and then React sort of diffs it and figures out what to change in the DOM. So it's not changing everything over here, it's only changing the portions that need updated. So if we went and looked at what's going on with that bit of the code, and you can see what's flashing is only this one little bit of our page is flashing saying it's changing. So the rest of this isn't. And that's React doing its magic behind the scenes so it knows what changed, even though it's re-rendering this whole functional component because it doesn't know what else to do but render the whole functional component. So that's the, what I'm saying is there's a difference between that and the way a class component works. So a class component doesn't get completely re-rendered when the state or props change, and that's what we're doing in this case is we're just changing our props for our clock, right? It's rendering it with different props. Class component, though, continues to exist. That same instance of your component stays around And what happens is it runs through the component update lifecycle when your state or props change, as opposed to it recreating it from scratch. And in React, this is the last key bit of the React system, is there's 3 different life cycles for a class-based React component. There's the mounting/creating life cycle, there's the updating life cycle, and there's the unmounting/removing life cycle. So this is if you have a class component, these are the bits of life cycle that it goes through as you work with this component. Any questions on that so far? All right, so let's go through them bit by bit, and then I'm going to show you a nice graphic that I think really helps visualize it. And then we'll start creating together, hopefully, a component that sort of uses a lot of these lifecycle methods, maybe not all of them, and then maybe there'll be some extra time where we'll just sort of go over some of the other ones, answer some different questions, or try out some different examples. So the mounting life is when a component is first created. And that's a little vague. So a component is first created essentially the first time that React needs to render it, is really what happens. And the mounting lifecycle is pretty simple for the most part. It calls the constructor, of course, because it calls that when you new up your object. And then it calls render. And then the key method that we haven't talked about before in the mounting lifecycle is component did mount gets called. And so this is a method that gets called letting you know, oh, your component did mount. Now, any of these can be overridden, and so can all the ones in any of these other life cycles, so we can have our own custom behavior, right? So the next life cycle, and this is the most common one for a class component, this is the one that a class component goes through more often than any other, is the updating life cycle. So this occurs whenever a component gets new props passed into it, when set state is called to change the state, or when force update is called. So those are the 3 ways that you trigger this life cycle on a React component. And this life cycle calls render, because it needs to render whatever happened. And then it calls component did update, which is yet another hook if we need to hook in and do something whenever our component updates. Any questions so far on these? All right. And then the last one is the unmounting lifecycle. So this one doesn't happen anywhere near as frequently. This is whenever the component, like what it would be rendering, is getting removed from the DOM entirely. Then you go through the unmounting lifecycle. So here for the Drupal, I think is another room or somewhere else. That's okay. So the unmounting lifecycle is less frequent. You usually don't have to do too much on it, but it's more about cleaning up anything that you need to clean up for your component. And the key part of the unmounting lifecycle is it calls this component will unmount method, so that you can do something to clean up stuff when your component's being unmounted. So those are the 3 major life cycles to a React component. And you can override each one of these lifecycle methods in a component to handle whatever specific needs you end up having for your component. So we've already overridden 2 of these lifecycle methods in our class components. Can anyone say which ones we've overridden? We can go back through the 3 slides if we want. What? Render, yep. Can you have another one, Diana? I can go back to these slides. Let's see. Here's the first slide. So we said render. Are there any others on this one that have overridden or used? Constructor. Yep. All right, and one of these is required to be overridden in a class component. You always have to define your own version of this method. Which one's that? What? Not the constructor. And the render. Good job. Yeah. Because you have to render something, right? So your component absolutely has to render something. So yeah, the rest of this is going to be hands-on. Let's start working through stuff. So what I want to do is, if you already have your Create React App project and you feel comfortable working in the one that you've already created, that's fine. You can work off of that. If you want to create another one, feel free. What I would suggest is, at the root of wherever before you're in the project folder for another project, then do like Create React App the same way we did before and name whatever project you want. But you don't have to do that. You can just use the one that you already have. I created one. I called it React Lifecycle Examples, but that's just for us today. You guys can name it something different. And then once you're there and you've got that up and running, we're going to start going through the process of trying to build out a clock that uses some of these lifecycle methods to do a hands-on exercise of stuff and learning how it works and why you would use them at different points in time. So let me know when you've got, if you've already done npm start and you can see the results of your Create React App project running, let me know if you're at that point, and then we can start stepping into creating a component that's going to manage some of its own state and have some life cycle properties around it. You there? You got a problem?
Yeah, maybe.
What do we got?
So that means I just see a bunch of errors.
All right. Well, let's see. Scroll down. So the key here is you're not in your My App folder. You're at your root of your workspace. So you don't go into the folder up there. You have to go in down here. So you need to cd into my-app and then try the command again. CD space. Yeah. Now you can try npm start again from there and it should work.
Oh.
All right. Does anybody have their stuff up and running yet? Yeah.
So you want us to put all the code today on the app.js?
It's not all going to live in that file. We're going to get some practice creating other files as well. So this is going to be really the most hands-on we've been. We're going to be doing a lot of new things, but hopefully none of it's too complicated on its own. We'll do it step by step, sort of walk through it as a group.
For now, it's on the app.js.
Well, so once you've got your stuff up and running, I just want to know that you've been able to run npm start and you can see your site running. Is everybody at that point? They can see their web page running from having done npm start. Yeah? You there? All right. Well, let's start working through this together. So the first thing I want to do is we're not going to start with, we're not going to assume that everything's going to go in app.js. Instead, what I want us to do from this Create React App, and this is sort of working off this approach of, I've talked about abstraction and assuming that stuff works. So let's sort of assume that we're going to have a clock component and we're going to put it in a separate file. So the first thing we need to do is import that so we have a reference to it in this. So I created a clock component at the same level here. but I said import clock from like ./clock.js. And at this point, once you do that, you're going to see that your build should be failing. And it should be failing because clock.js doesn't exist. So the next thing to do is to create in this same folder as app.js a clock.js file. It needs to have the same case, so it needs to be like uppercase clock.js. And it should probably still be failing, I think, at that point, because it's telling you don't have an export from that or something. So the very next thing to do to get our stuff passing right now, and that's sort of what you want to do, is you want your code to be working, like you don't want to have huge periods of time where it's not working, because the longer window you have where you just have errors and you're doing something like this, the harder it is to find what really caused the problem. So what we'll do is, I'm going to ignore mine right now for a second. So I'm going to comment all this out and move it down a little bit. At the very top of our clock.js file, we can export default. And this is sort of the most minimal way for us to do sort of a component that's going to make something happy. Is we could say function. It doesn't matter. You could do it with function or an arrow function. And then just put some curly braces. And if you want to, you could say return null. So you're telling it what's going on in this clock.js file is I've got a very, very basic function here. Let me get my stuff running too, Stu. Now we'll be doing the same thing, and you guys should be able to see the same results on my system as we're seeing on yours. Jumped over to here. I'll move it over to the very end here. Let me push this stuff down even more so you can't see it right now. So this is the most basic, like this is a functional component that's really returning nothing, right? It's just returning null. But it is a functional component. And once you reach that point, then your code should see something like this, right? Compiled successfully. No? All right, that, what? Your compile failed still? And this is why, see, this is what is great to learn, right? We've got something that's about as minimal as it can possibly be. And so we know that we don't have a lot of things to look at to figure out what's wrong with the code. If instead we had tried to write all of the code first and then you had this failure, you would have a lot of things that could be causing the problem instead of a very small possible set of things causing the problem. Yes, you missed something very subtle here. You need a dot in front of it to tell it this is the same folder. / means this folder. All right, and that's fine. It's telling you that you imported clock, but you're not using it. Should also, by the way, name it with an uppercase C when you import it. So import, because components should always use uppercase names. All right, do other people have that working? Is it building? All right, let's go see.
Oh, never mind.
It's all down there. Awesome. So you should be able to see like just a blank page or something, or maybe there you still see your Reacts. Welcome to React. They're working together. You're already you're even going to the next step. That's great. You have the rest of it. Is it compiling right now? So once we've got this, the next thing I want to do is go over to your app.js file and get rid of anything that was in the body of this except for this opening and closing div, and just replace it with an instance of the clock component. Anything between the two divs, and just replace it with an instance of your clock component. And then once you save that, it should re-render, you should compile successfully, and then you should see a nice, I can probably minimize this, I think. Should see a nice blank page. There we go. So I see hands when you get to a blank page. Are you there?
I'm lost.
You're lost? All right. Let's see what we can do.
I'm trying to use
Okay, yeah, the first deal is, again, you got the same issue as him. You're not in the right folder here. So you need to CD into your My App. Yep. And from there, you can do npm start. And that should work. Oh, you play with a Google login component, huh?
yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I was able to get that
That's sweet.
yeah, I like it. Wanted to get that one, then
Okay. Yeah. Post in Slack about what you play with. You know, maybe somebody else will be interested. Want to do something as well. All right. So you've created a clock, minimal clock. So let's bring our code back here, and we can get rid of count up.
So I can type all.
Yeah. If you want, you can create a separate file instead of having it in the same app.js file. What you're doing.
So it still can run it like this.
Yeah, all we would do is, if you create a separate file, like you could call it clock app or something, I don't know. Then in your index.js, instead of importing your app, you would import the clock app and use it, and that way you wouldn't have to have it all within the same file.
Yeah, I'll do what else.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not sure what's wrong, but mine is just like that, but it's still like, when I go on here, it just shows me like an error.
All right, well, let's go look. Probably in your clock component then, instead of in here. All right, so let's go over and look at our clock.js file. I don't think you saved this. Well, dot says you didn't save it, so let's save this file, and that might fix your problem. There we go.
Oh, it's just supposed to be white.
Yeah, it's just white right now.
Oh.
We're gonna build this up. We're gonna build something up, but I wanna do it piece by piece and make sure we're all on the same page so that people don't get too far behind. At least for these first several steps, we're gonna go pretty slow. It might speed up later if I feel like we need to move it along a little more, but this is the first time we've done something like create a component in a separate file and export it. So, you know, we're doing sort of some of that just hands-on because I don't think that there's much point in talking about that. Let's just work through it. All right. Do you need me to go back to this? Are you there? No problem. I'm going to get rid of this now because I don't think I need it. What's that?
Just like go through all your tabs and out of nowhere, it's just straight a white page.
All right. So once we have everyone there, what I want to do next is convert this. Let's create a class component instead of what we have, and we're going to have it just say like clock right now, right? So we're going to build this up piece by piece. Export. So what we did here was we exported this function out of this file, and we called it the default export. What that means is when we import, we didn't have to use brackets around anything that's not the default export, but the default export you can just import without brackets, and you can name it whatever you want in where you imported it. Doesn't matter what you call it. You can rename it however you want to rename it. So you notice it had no name here. We had a function without any name, but when we imported it, we called it clock. And it's just a very simple functional component. So now I'm going to delete all that. I'm going to have you the first step you need to do when you're creating a functional component in a separate file is you need to import React and probably the component named export from React as well. So what this is doing is giving you access to the React package and component. It's not clear why you need to import React, but it's for a variety of sort of just believe me and trust it type reasons right now. Component is much more clear when we start building it out, and that's because we actually reference that. We extend to the component in our app. So this is the first step. And then we start building it out, and we could do it line by line as a class. So a class component starts with the keyword class, the name of your component, and then we always extend component. And then the one thing that every class component has to do is it has to override which function from the base class? What's that? Has to override the render function from the base class. That's right. So we define a render function. And in this case, I'm defining a pretty simple one. It's not doing too much. It's just returning a div with the word clock in it. Trying to keep it just about as basic as I can. And then the last step here is since we got rid of our previous export, we need to export this. So I've got a line down here that says export default and then a reference to my clock class. So that's the default export from this file. So once you get to this point, let me know when you're there, and what you should have is just clock, just the word clock showing up in your output, nothing else. Yeah.
Are we supposed to delete the export line?
The original export, yes.
Oh,
That was just being used so that we knew that our code was working in terms of importing something and getting our like the app.js file now shouldn't need to change is the key. We wanted to make sure that we got the app.js file working correctly, and now we're working in this clock.js file. We're just changing what we're exporting. The app.js file doesn't know anything about that. It just continues to import the default component and works with it. I'm gonna bounce over here real fast just to see if anybody's been saying anything on Slack. Can't see what I am typing. All right, I don't know if I can, they said it's too high. I don't know if I can fix that very much or not. Let's see what's going on here. Oh, nope, I'm not gonna be able to see how to fix that. All right. So yeah, the word clock showing up. Are we good? No? If you're getting errors, look at the output message it's telling you, because it'll probably be pointing you at the line that has the problem. Anybody have clock showing up yet in their output?
It's not showing. It's showing an error on, for me, it's line 5 and it's the div block.
Mine says for default, this clock was not found in the clock.js.
All right, let's go look around and see what I can do to help out. What do we got here? Unexpected token. Ah, you're using curly braces around your return instead of parentheses.
Oh.
Think that'll get you there? All right. The difference between them is the curly braces produce a block, and they're used for a block. Parentheses are used to set off an expression. So that's how you say this is an expression. I wanted to evaluate that way. Class clock extends component. Render, return, div, clock. All right, you're not exporting it. You're missing your export for your clock. It needs to be after you import it. It has to be at the bottom, or after you've declared it. So you have to put it down here because it has to be after your clock has been declared. Export default, and then you just want to export your class. So export default space clock. You have base clock. Working for you? All right. How about you?
Yeah.
We're good? Right. Yep. Should get you there. Some more that's fine right now. Let's go look. What we got? All right. There we go. We've created our first component in a separate file. So this is the way that we'll typically be working when we're creating components going forward, is most of your components will live in their own file. It makes it very easy to work with. It makes that file very encapsulated, so you can go in there and look at everything about that component and really understand what's going on. So that's going to be our sort of default construction mechanism. Creating a file very similar to this to be working with components. Now, not every component will be a class component because sometimes you don't need any internal state. And if you don't need internal state, or you don't need to deal with lifecycle methods for some reason, then you probably don't need a class component. And I encourage using functional components instead because they're easier to reason about. But in this case, we're showing life cycles and we need internal state, so we're going to create a class component.
So does that mean like we use functional component or like a little bit like less complicated stuff and like class component or complicated stuff?
Yes, yeah. In general, so that's a general way to say it, is a lot of times your more complicated stuff might be a class component, but what you really want to aim for is to have as little or try and keep your state that changes in as few places as possible, and have a lot of building blocks that don't change state, just be things, functional components. So even if you have something that manages state and is sort of complex, inside of that component, it may render a lot of functional components to sort of keep that logic simple. So I might show an example of that later near the end here, where I could show you how we could break this clock down to make it, to split out the render portion from the state management portion, so that each piece can be a little more independent. But right now we're going to have it sort of grouped together like this. All right, so we've got our class component. It's great. But what we're not doing is showing anything for a clock, so it's horribly useless. All right, let me try and pull up my, close that. Let me pull up my clock stuff here and see if we can, I'll pull up my old clock example. We may use it as a reference. Because what we want is something more like this, right? Let's aim for something more like this right now. And then we're going to keep building on this clock, building stopwatch and other capabilities through the rest of this, not just this class, but the rest of the classes, to sort of build out a much more complex React app. But let's try and get towards something that's closer to this, except we want all of this state management about the time changing to be inside of our component. So anyone have any thoughts or any guesses about what our next step would be if we want to sort of manage this stuff inside of our component instead of outside? We probably need to add in some sort of state. So what do we want to, well, let's look at what we're doing over here real fast. What are the things that we're doing in this? So let's break down the steps or the different aspects of things that we're working with over here, so that we can make sure that we're doing those same sorts of things over in our class component. It can be anything. What are the different things that we're doing in this file, you know, across all these different bits?
Telling it to re-render after like every second.
Yeah, we're setting some sort of timer, right? A timeout. There we go. Here, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a note section over here. What interval, right? Setting a timer or interval. Yep, that's one of the things we're doing in here, right? That's good. I'll expand on that a little more even. For 1 second. All right, what else are we doing in here? So that's what this is doing, right? And we're calling render. Maybe what are we doing inside of render? We're running this render part over and over again. We're doing some stuff even before that. Yep. We're creating a date variable set to the current time / date, right? And then we're setting other variables to portions of the date, time data. Keep it in the same order. Time / date data, right? Perfect. And then we're doing, what's that last step you already talked about? Running React DOM.render, right? But I'm going to change that a little bit and say re-rendering the component by running React DOM.render, right? So the key part here is re-rendering the component. All right, so we've got a few things that we know that we need to do in our clock if we want to sort of capture all of this, right? So let's look at the first thing. We need to set some sort of timer interval for 1 second. Now the interesting question is, where's the best place to do this? Ooh, I totally forgot about this. I'm going to step back for a second. Sorry for anyone on the call too. I really wanted to show this. So let's talk about the lifecycle methods, and I'll send out a link to this. I'll post it. This is a great visualization of what's going on with lifecycle methods. So here's the 3 different life cycles for a React component. You've got the mounting life cycle, the updating life cycle, and the unmounting life cycle. And so when you're mounting, this is the order of actions that it does. It calls the constructor, and I'm going to show you real fast. There are some other ones in here that exist, but in general, they're not used that often, so you don't need to know about them right now. So we're going to keep them hidden. But it calls the constructor, and then it calls the render method, and then it calls component did mount. And then when you're updating a component, which means it got new props, it called set state, it called force update, any of that, it calls render, updates everything in the DOM just like it did on mounting, and then calls component did unmount, and then unmounting just jumps right down to this component will unmount. So this even has a nice little bit over here telling you, sort of suggesting when you might do things. So the render phase, which is everything above this dotted line, it says these should be pure and have no side effects. So anything you're doing in here should have no side effects. This may be paused, aborted, or restarted by React. And then down here in your commit phase is when you can work with the DOM, run side effects, schedule updates, etc. So let me give you a little bit of a hint here. Let's say we know that we want to set this timer up, but we want to do it, or set an interval, but we want to do it once for our component when it gets mounted. So that gives us, out of here, that gives us how many different options for where we could do this work. For lifecycle methods.
One more time.
What? Oh yeah. How many options do we have? Where could we, if I say we know we want to do this, set up this interval when we're in mounting. So at some point in the mounting life cycle, we want to set this interval or a timer of some kind. Where are the possible options for us to do that? Component did mount, that's one of them. Constructor, and we've got one other option. Render, right? So let's look at each one of those real fast and try and figure out where we want to put this logic. Let's assume that we're wanting to set some sort of timer, right? All right, so let's start with render. What are the pros and cons of putting this logic in render? It would do it every time it renders, it would get called, right? And we want to only set up this interval call once, not every time. And since render doesn't just get called in mounting, it gets called whenever you update, it's probably not the option that we want to go for where we want to set this up, right? So we can rule render out as the place to do that, because really all we want to do in the render function is logic around how do we render our components. So that leaves the constructor or component did mount as what seem like our logical options for where to put this initialization. And to tell you the truth, there's reasons that you would go with maybe either one. But if we go over and take a look at the React documentation, and if we looked at what it says for the constructor, you know, we know we need to initialize our state here. So let's, before we even do the timer, let's go ahead and initialize some state in our constructor. So we're going to add a constructor method to our, indentation's all wrong. Using spaces to, yes, all right. So we know we're going to want a constructor. And in here, we want to set our state, initialize it. So that's just this dot state equals, and then we want something like state's going to have some property or some key in there. And let's call the key let's call it date time. We're going to initialize it to null. Or actually, let's initialize it to new date. So it's going to have whatever the date is when this constructor first gets called in there. So we've gone ahead and put that into our constructor, right? And now we have some state here. So I feel bad. I'm like I said, we're doing this live, so we may do the order a little differently than I was planning. But if we have this as a value now in our state from when we're creating, oop, there's going to be a bug with this. I forgot. We want to remember what we have to do before we reference this inside of our constructor. You always have to call the super class constructor by calling super. Otherwise, your this will not work. So we have to do that. Otherwise, this would have failed when it tried to construct our clock. And we could see that if we wanted to. We should be able to see that. Not here in this. Oh, it even tells us, look, it gives us a nice warning. This is not allowed before super. Hey, it's so nice, so helpful. Had you already encountered that? You were like, haha. All right, so we have to call our super. So that's calling the constructor of our base class or super class. Same thing, different terminology. And then we can set a date time or whatever we're going to set. Now this shouldn't change anything about what we're rendering. So if we go and look at our component, we should be rendering the same thing we were before. But we do have something in our state now that we could render off of. So let's change up our order of steps a little bit. I'm going to switch our steps around in terms of how we're going to do things. And I'm going to, so we've already created a date variable set to the current date time, at least when our component is created, right? So let's say this is our next step. We want to set some other variables to portions of the date/time data. So if we want to do that, let's go back and look at this life cycle again. If we want to set some other variables to a portion of our date/time data using the same logic we had before, where might we want to do that in this life cycle? What seems to make sense? Any guesses? Maybe in render? Why is that? Because we've already called the constructor. There's some other good reasons why render makes sense.
Adding in it's rendering what we added into the render.
Because, well, yeah, I mean, some reasons are because it's sort of part of rendering, and we want to change, we want to recompute those values anytime this data changes, right? And render is going to get called anytime any of that data changes, so it's an opportunity to recompute those values. And then there's one that's not so like obvious, but a general statement, a good concept when you're working with React components is don't save data that you can derive. So don't store data that you can derive from other data that you stored. So if we stored our date time and these other 2 bits of data that we're going for, like time and like formatted date or something like that, those are just purely derived off of our date time. You know, that we don't have to do anything else, then we shouldn't be storing that. We can just compute it when we need it. And when we need it is at render. So that's a great time to do that. So let's go ahead and basically, this is me being lazy, right? Good lazy programmer. I'm just going to go ahead and steal these lines. Yeah, I'll have to change them, but steal them right from there to start. And I can't just refer to date. I need to refer to, how do I get access to what I have now? Date time, but this dot state dot date time. And then this will change the same way. This dot state dot date time. And now we've got a couple nice local variables. And to continue to steal from my previous bit of code, and I know you guys don't have it up, so you can't steal it as easily. I'm just gonna go ahead and steal what we had for this render and replace my return with that and just change these variable references to be what I need them to be, which are now time and formatted date. All right, so let's see what happens with this. Looks good for me. And if we go look in the browser, awesome. We have a date and a time showing up. We're rendering something. All right, let's see some thumbs up or hands up or something when you guys get to this point. Anybody have this? Yeah? One of you? Go check on here. Super. Sweet. All right, anybody having problems? You got some problems? We're gonna have to, I will have to move a little faster through the later part of this, but I'm glad we're spending the time on this portion at least to make sure that we're all getting some practice creating components like this. Right, add the constructor. Constructor function is not inside of your clock class. So it's a method. Your clock so it needs to exist inside of this. Not inside of the render. It's a peer of the render, but it's inside of your clock component. So yeah, that should work. All right. Yeah. All right, so you have a semicolon somewhere I didn't expect. What looks like to me. Oh, you're not setting your state correctly. No, because you can't set it just this dot date time. You need to set, and you have a colon there. So here, I'll pull that portion back up. And then, like I say, I'll have to go a little faster for the other portion, but I feel like we've gotten some good hands-on through at least this much. Some more practice. So it's this dot state, because you're setting the state thing, equals, and then an object literal notation.
Oh, yeah, it works.
All right. So we've got something rendering, which is great. The only problem is we're not updating, right? We're not changing anything. But since we're holding on to our date time and our state now, we're not going to be updating it with an external set interval. We need to do something internally. The most logical places to do that, as we talked about, were either the constructor or the did component mount. And if we go look real fast, we'll see some interesting notes here for the React documentation, which is great. It says the constructor is called before mounting. Typically in React, constructors are only used for two purposes: initializing local state and binding event handlers. You should not call set state in the constructor, etc. So let's sort of go off the assumption it doesn't seem like that's the right place to do that, right? Component did mount. Component did mount is invoked immediately after a component is mounted. If you need initialization that requires DOM nodes should go here. If you need to load data from a remote endpoint, this is a good place to instantiate the network request. Seems like this might be a good place to put our interval logic, right? So we're going to go ahead and we just need to create this. So it was component did mount. And you can see I've got some nice tooling that helps suggest some of that for me inside of my Visual Studio Code. And it actually does. The interesting thing is it takes, oh, I guess component did mount does not. That's interesting. It doesn't have any properties passed into it. A lot of these other ones do. So in here, we're going to want to hook up this set interval. So again, being a good lazy programmer, I'm like, I don't want to rewrite my stuff. So let me go look at what I did here. I set some sort of interval and just gave it a function, a reference to a function to call, and said 1,000. All right, so I'm going to steal this bit of code, tiny little bit of code. I want to set some sort of interval. I need to give it to a reference to call every second. Something to do. So what should we call? What function should we give it to call every second? Time, but what's that going to do? So here's what I would suggest, right? Let's create a new method, because we can add whatever methods we want on our component here. Let's create a method called, and this is almost straight out of the React documentation for this stuff too. So we're going to create a method called tick. So it's like a timer, tick. And we're just going to reference that. So since this is on our object, and to get references to anything on yourself, you use this. It's just this dot tick. So that's the function reference that I'm passing into my set interval. So every second, I want to call this function. And then I'm going to go ahead and I could write some logic in here, but really fast before I do that, I'm going to do like a console.log just to test that this works, right? Tick called. Actually, I'm going to make a bad joke here instead. That probably nobody will get, but it's going in there because I love my superheroes. So it's a reference to the tick,
Uh,
a hilariously dumb superhero.
I kind of get it.
And I'm going to, so let's pull up the inspector just to see what's happening. Look at our console. And we can see this count is going up. I could tell it to not group similar, I think. And then we should see it, it's gonna group them anyways. So we see this going up. So every second, I'm calling that tick method. Tick, 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 right? Except that's not what I want to do. I don't really just want to call the console. Instead, I want to change my date. So what were we doing before? Again, this goes back to our notes here. In our timer, every second we were creating a date variable and setting it to the current date time, right? Well, we don't need to create a date variable. Instead, we just need to reset our state value for our date time. So how do we change our state? What method do we call? Set state, right? And then what we do is we pass it in a new object that is going to mix into the existing object so that it overrides whatever we have in there that this has properties for. So we want to reset the date time property. And what do we want to set it to? Every second? We want to just set it to a new date. Just get a new date at that point in time. Because that date will have the current date and time and everything else. So now what we're doing is every second, thanks to this set interval, we're calling this method, which is setting our state and changing our date time value. And that should, nope, I've got a problem. Ah, yes. I've got a problem. So the problem is, if you guys remember from our previous class, this is a subtle one, is inside of tick, it doesn't have a proper reference to this. So I said, whenever you refer to this inside of a method, we need a special line, and I didn't even explain what it does. Anybody remember what it was? This dot tick equals this dot tick dot bind this. Special little line. And since tick has a reference to this inside of it, we have to do it this way. And if we go look now, we've now got a class component that's updating its own state and re-rendering every time that changes. Yeah. I can minimize this too. Let people see a little more of the.
You go again, talk about the, why you did
This magic line right here. It's a magic line that you should pretty much just write for every method that you have in your component if that method has this inside of it. And since this tick method has this inside of it, you need to write this magic line for it. I can explain it if you want to in like the last 10 minutes of class, but it's very much a deep JavaScript issue of what's going on. It's one of the most confusing aspects of JavaScript. A lot of people get very confused when they have to deal with what happens with this in JavaScript. So for now, just take it as one of those things like you just have to do this. It's a bit of magic and it gets stuff working. Anybody have this working? Yeah. Got one person at least. Yes.
So I just realized that I went back to the React app and I have the time for the top and the bottom. Like the time shows up on the top and on where the date's supposed to be because the time the end.
No, yeah, that's because you did to-locale time string in both places. This one is to-locale date string.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, I have an error, it says render and then brings line 25.
Mm-hmm.
I'm error.
So you probably just have a parentheses or curly brace wrong somewhere in your tick. So let's see here. Yeah, you've got a, you don't have your closing, no, you can, yeah, you can close it there. You don't have a closing parentheses because this, if you come down here, one of the great things about these is they'll help show you where stuff matches up. So if you do this, you see that this parenthesis matches that, or this curly brace matches that. Sorry, I used the wrong term, right? And if I move over, you can see that this parenthesis matches that. But then you don't have a matching curly brace for this. So you need to add one more curly brace to match that, and then you need a or a comma after it. Oh no, you don't need a comma, sorry. No, you need nothing. It's uppercase D. There we go. Yeah, that's a really useful thing. If nobody caught what I was just saying, and you're not familiar with it, if you watch this editor, even Cloud9 has it. So if you're seeing one of these problems and you can't tell if everything matches up in terms of like curly braces and parentheses and stuff, if you look, each editor will do it a little differently, but if you look right now where my cursor is flashing, you can see that the matching curly brace is also highlighted. And if I go one over, you'll see that the matching parenthesis is highlighted. So it's an easy way to try and figure out what the matching pairs are. And that'll help you figure out if you're missing one, because you might be like, oh, wait a minute, there should be another one after this, but that says this matches here. That happens all the time. That's why this is built in just about every IDE under the sun. All right, so working this way. This is awesome. We've got it updating. We're using local state. We're using one of our lifecycle methods. This component did mount. Now, one problem that wouldn't be obvious here with what we've done so far is that we set this interval to happen. But if this component got unmounted from our browser somehow, then we may have an issue. So if somehow this component ceased to exist in our browser, it's still going to try and call this .tick, even though that won't exist anymore. So I'm going to do a little bit of code here that is going to do just that. This is just me sort of solving it very quickly. This isn't exactly like an ideal solution, but I just want you guys to be able to see what would happen if that component ended up getting unmounted. And then we'll add another lifecycle hook to deal with that situation so that we don't have this problem. So let me do this. I'm gonna say remove clock. And here I'm going to say, I think this will work. Let's see if this works. Pull this up, it's happy there. All right, we're working exactly what I want. All right, so now I'm gonna go ahead and just add in another something else here. And it'll just be like a button. And it's gonna have a handler. It's gonna get called. Let's do this guy here. Actually, you know what? I'm just gonna write it in line. Remove clock equals true. Put braces around that guy. let's see if this works. So I got a little button here. It says remove clock. And if I click it, it may not work. All right. You know what's going on? This guy isn't re-rendering. That's what's going on. Okay, I need to attach this to, you know what? I'll just do it inside of here. It'll be a little weird, but whatever. This .force update. This is not the way you would write this stuff normally. I'm just trying to throw it out there pretty quickly. All right, so we're rendering, we're updating, we're ticking along. And now we had an error. Because it's trying to call set state or do something on like my component that I got rid of. It's trying to do some stuff with this thing, really shouldn't be. Or actually, I guess it is still calling the tick function, but all sorts of stuff is going wrong. Like it tried to call set state inside of there on this thing and boom, you know, we don't want to do that. So what we want to do is when this component gets unmounted, we want to clean up this interval. We want to delete it. So the first thing we need to do, and this, I'm going to have to pull up documentation just to make sure I have this right. Are you not showing up? You're not going to show up with whatever I have in here right now. All right. I'll look for it this way. So what we actually look at if we dig up the documentation for set interval is set interval actually returns a value. And it tells us a little bit about it over here. A number representing the ID value of the timer that is set. Use this value with the clear interval method to cancel the timer. All right, so we've got an idea for what we can do to clear this. So I'm going to set something. This dot interval ID equals set interval. So I'm going to hold on to that in my component. And now what I need is to do something when my component is unmounted. Does anybody remember what that lifecycle method is called? Yep. We have update. All right, let's go look at our component will unmount. So component will unmount. And in here, I want to call clear interval. And I want to give it the ID of my interval so that it'll quit running. So that when my component gets unmounted, it's not going to keep trying to update itself anymore.
So if you want to, if you're like creating a React app and you want to add like a delete functionality, not big unmount.
You might need to. You only need to use that if you have cleanup that you need to do. In this case, we'd set something up that we needed to clean up, right? But you don't always have that. Typically, you don't really have cleanup that you have to do outside of the component, but sometimes you do. In this case, that's the way that we did set interval and everything. That had to be cleaned up externally because we have to call clear interval to say, be done with this, you know, do something, right? And so now if we click remove clock, we don't get our error message. We're all good, and we see our time, our count here quit ticking up. So we deleted. And you notice, like, we didn't do anything special to delete that component. All that happened was this app didn't render it. And by this not rendering it, then React knew, oh, since I'm not rendering that component anymore, I need to delete the instance of it that I have. So we could add another button here, right? Like, let's duplicate this guy. And I'm going to have this be remove clock equals false. And we'll call this add clock. it's only going to work after we've, you know, in fact, I'm going to do a little bit more here, tiny bit of extra logic, so that this will only show up. Remove clock and this. So this is a little bit of this is sort of what's known as like a guard. So what I did is, this is a little bit that says, if remove clock is true, then give me this result. If it's false, then just be false. It's a little bit of a hack, but it's one you'll see a lot in like a React app. So now that button should only appear if we removed our clock. So I'm going to remove the clock. Now I've got add clock. And I can add it back in and remove it and add it. But here's what I'm going to do, just so you guys can see what I'm talking about here. Here we have component did mount. So let's log something here too, right? Console.log. Created a new instance of clock, right? In fact, let me go back here and make this code a little. I'm going to wrap this first button in this too, so that, just because I'm obsessive compulsive like this, not remove clock, and show the remove clock button. So it will show up at the opposite times of the other one. And so now what we've got, we created a new instance of clock. Boom, 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 we're logging. I'm going to remove it. Click add clock, and we created a new instance of our clock. Because when React doesn't render it, it knows to clean that thing up. It says, oh, unmount this guy, we're done with it. But if I create another one, I'll create another instance of it at that point in time. So that's leveraging some of these lifecycle methods, right? And actually what we used here in this one aren't necessarily the most common ones. You're much more frequently going to be, if you're hooking to lifecycle methods, the lifecycle of a component is going through the updating cycle much more often than anything else. So component did update is the more frequent lifecycle method that you'll hook into, as opposed to, you know, what we were just leveraging. So we could do something in there if we wanted. In this case, since I was telling you not to save derived state, so we probably shouldn't necessarily do what I'm probably going to do here, but I'm going to just modify derived state and component did update and save it in my state, even though ideally you wouldn't do that, just so you guys can get an example of that. So let's, you know what, I won't make it derived state. I'm going to make it random, I think. Going to set a color on my state here, and then I'm going to add something in our component did update method. The interesting thing about this one is you can actually do something if you want to based off the props that just got passed into your component. So you can do some logic based off of that. I'm not going to, we're just going to do something sort of random here. I don't know. What I'm doing, I'm just making something up for fun. This dot set state color. I'm going to randomly. I don't think you're supposed to set state and component did update. Hold on, it's going to yell at me. This is bad practice. Yes, but see, note that it must be wrapped in a condition or you'll cause an infinite loop. because what'll happen is I'll update the state, which will cause it to re-render, which will cause it to update the state, which will cause it to re-render, which will cause it to update the state. So I can't actually do what I was going to do in here. Because every time I change that state, it'll re-render, which will call component did update, which will change the state, which will re-render. So it'll go into an infinite loop, locking everything up because it's continually updating the state and re-rendering. So I'm not going to put that in right now. We'll work on one of those another time. Yeah, we'll play with that another time. I almost caught myself in an infinite loop. Yeah, if you haven't done it in programming, I've been in so many infinite loops in my code. What?
I've done a lot of things.
Happens all the time. All right, are there any questions about this lifecycle stuff? So this is like the last big piece of React, the last major bit to learn. And then you've got all of the, I mean, there's a lot more to learn about how to compose things and some very high level concepts about things that are really advanced, higher order components, render like functions and all sorts of other complex bits. But this is the surface of React, right? Like there's not any other major things to learn. We'll talk more about different events and we'll talk about how to do forms and handle data and controlled inputs and stuff, which are all just sort of built on these concepts. So the more that you can reinforce these few concepts that we've already worked with, the better off you're going to be. So any questions on this stuff right now?
I remember it's not about like this.
Yeah.
It's like a GitHub.
Yeah, I'm going to, I'll post this up and then a link to this so that everyone can start from something like this for the next class. That way everyone has the same starting point instead of, you know, having to start at different points. Probably get rid of my tick references, but a proper tick reference would be spoon anyway, since that's his battle cry. But all right, so I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about what's going on with that bind bit. You're probably going to get lost. I know the first like 10 times I've learned something like this, I've gotten lost. And it's very JavaScript specific. I don't think I can do justice to this on the video, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the video right now. But if anybody wants to look into this a little bit, you can, as to why you have to do that. They even have some documentation on the React site about it, but it's probably not deep enough. Otherwise, I'll see you guys next Tuesday because we should have